Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of the Slave Food Conversation, where we'll be discussing food as chains. I am Danette Batiste, a member of the Slave Food team, and today we are happy to bring to you our slave food doctors. I'll introduce again for you Dr. Columbus Batiste, who is a board-certified cardiologist and chief of cardiology in Southern California. Dr. Batiste's mission is to share information so that each one can teach one about the benefits of plant-based nutrition, daily exercise, and stress reduction. This mission has led to the formation of a nonprofit organization called the Healthy Heart Nation, which provides education through lectures, newsletters, social, and digital media. Dr. Eric Walsh was born in Hartford, Connecticut. He is a graduate of the University of Miami School of Medicine, Loma Linda University School of Public Health, where he received his master's and doctorate in public health. Dr. Walsh has embarked on his own plant-based journey and as a result has lost more than 70 pounds by adopting this lifestyle. Dr. Walsh has committed his life to speaking around the globe through his preaching and healing ministries. Today, the Slave Food team is welcome and is excited to be joined by Cynthia Chia-Penn. Cynthia is an internationally known published author, medical contributor, and authoritative voice on plant-based food of the African diaspora. She is a professionally trained plant-based chief and nutritional consultant who specializes in macrobiotics, raw and living foods, and vegan modalities, including gluten-free and disease-sensitive meals. In addition to her culinary training, she has a master's degree in international relations with an emphasis in sub-Saharan agrarian cultures. Her passion for Africa and its diaspora is multifaceted. She offers a unique, informed, alluring approach to food and the continent. Dr. Yahura Williams is the Dean of College of Arts and Sciences and received his PhD in history from Howard University in 1998. He brings a wealth of experience to St. Thomas, including serving as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Fairfield University, Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs at Fairfield University, and Chief Historian for the Jackie Robinson Foundation, and a work of a consultant with the Office of Domestic Preparedness. We thank you and welcome you back to the Slave Food Conversation. We'll turn it over to you, Dr. Batiste.
All right, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm humbled to be in the presence of Chef Penn and Dr. Williams. It's a great honor to have you guys on board with Dr. Walsh and myself. I'm excited about this conversation. I've been looking forward to this for 2 weeks. We paused last week, and I am so excited. So welcome, welcome, welcome. First I'm gonna start ladies first, if you don't mind, Dr. Williams. I'm gonna jump in with her first. So what I wanna know is, number one, how did you get into this whole idea of culinary diaspora? And that's question number one. Question number two is, if you could choose anybody in history, any famous person, who would you love to cook for?
Well, I got into cooking. I give all credit to the Lord. 2008 hit. I lost my job. I was a director of a nonprofit. I couldn't find a job to save my life. I interviewed with Madonna to run her organization. I interviewed with Starbucks the next day. Didn't get either of those jobs. My church was looking for somebody to head health ministries. I said, I've got nothing else to do, did it, and I rediscovered my passion for cooking. And then I decided that I wanted to contribute to people's health, not to their demise. And people of color, we suffer because of what we eat. So I decided that I was going to learn and become excellent at plant-based cooking. And that began my journey in 2008, and here we are in 2020, and I love what I do every single day. One person to cook for, wow. One person to cook for. I mean, Obama. I would love to work for Obama. I would love to take him on a journey around the world on a plate and expose him to some of the African diaspora that he may not be familiar with.
I love it. Love it. That's a great answer. Great answer. Well, welcome. Looking forward to everything you're going to share with us during this conversation. Dr. Uhura, it's good to see you again. So I first met you when we shared time on the panel discussion, and I was immediately struck in awe and impressed by your wealth of knowledge. And so I did my quick little Google searching this brother right here, and I found out quickly that you're a humble man. You've been featured in CNN and everything else like that. So we are definitely honored to have you. So a couple of things. One is, my question for you is, now, if you could sit down with any one person, you're an authority inside the civil rights era time, right? One person who made substantial changes during that time that you could sit down and have a meal with, prepared by none other than ours on the show here, who would that person be?
It's a great question. Ella Baker, who helped to inspire the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We know her in connection with food for saying that the civil rights struggle was bigger than a hamburger. It was bigger than sitting in at restaurants and access to places of public accommodation. But I love her. I love her spirit. She was the person who really was the architect behind the sit-ins, who helped to provide inspiration to the young people who ultimately led those campaigns. So I would love to have the opportunity to have a conversation with her. And a longtime activist, going back to work she'd done in New York City in the 1930s, all the way through the civil rights era. So pretty amazing woman.
Wow. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing that. I'm humble. I'm ashamed to say I had no idea who she was. You know, I wasn't aware of her name and her contribution to the whole movement. So thank you for that. All right, let's dive right into it. So, you know, one of the things that we're talking about, Eric, you and I, is we talk about food as change an awful lot inside of a component of our talk. And just to recap that component, as we walk folks through, what we realize is the fact that many of us attribute we think that our current situation is really the heritage. It's our culture, who we are. And recognizing that we come from a different sort of stock. We have a different stock. And so we walk folks through a historical perspective and journey, really in that regards, and how food has essentially been used in particular ways. And so we want to dive into that conversation and start off by, Cynthia, what do you think, what was the diet like? What was diet like? What was the food like in West Africa, you know, hundreds of years ago?
The traditional diet in Africa was heavily plant-based. It was actually heavily plant-based, where you saw consumption of any kind of animal flesh was really on the coast, where there were a lot of fishing would take place. There are several reasons for that. I mean, it was accessible there. One of the reasons why meat was not so consumed so often is because there was no real way of preserving. There's no such thing as refrigeration. Meat was reserved for very, very special occasions. And those occasions were rare. So primarily tubers, root vegetables, you know, sorghum, millet, things like that. A lot of greens, cocoyam leaves and cassava leaf and sweet potato leaf. And all of those things were things that were primarily eaten. A lot of seeds. Periodically, ants would be eaten. You know, they were high in a protein source. So the traditional diet was very carbohydrate rich, but it was pure carbohydrates, nothing processed. It was just pure food where your body got the nutrients that it needed from the food and it got rid of the rest. So those were the original diet.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So you're telling me that carbs aren't bad for you, is what you're telling me.
Carbs, you know, that's a beautiful thing. Carbs are not bad for you. It's the carbs that you eat and how you prepare them, but they're energy. They're an energy source. And if you eat them correctly, they will serve you well.
Yeah, that's great. I know, Eric, that you spent time recently in Africa. And so what were some of the learnings that you had when you were out there, really in terms of like the diet, to add to what Chef Cynthia mentioned?
Well, it's funny because I was hoping while I was there to run into Chef Cynthia, and I missed her. But I did see that she even was on television and stuff over there. She was doing it big in Ghana, and I actually fell in love with the country. And I was out in Kumasi out in the Ashanti Kingdom, and they took me to a market, and I was blown away at the variety of vegetables, fruits, the colors of the food. And I was like, man, there's not a grocery store in America where you would find this laid out like this. I mean, the papayas, the mangoes, ginormous fruits, are super sweet. I'm plant-based, so I mean, the whole time I was there, they cooked me different, just as was just said, plant-based meals that were just absolutely phenomenal. I think what was interesting is I also did some lecturing at the University of Donna Legon, and was able to actually speak to some of their history professors. And I did ask one who's written a book on the difference between slavery in Africa before the Europeans came and the slavery of the West in America, Brazil, and the Caribbean, which is a phenomenal book. And she was a brilliant woman. But she described food, and just as was just said, they lived off the land. And the land was just rich and fertile, and they understood the importance of the food of the land, and the varieties of the food. And she described that that what is coming into Africa now. We talked about the fact that there was a Kentucky Fried Chickens there now and stuff like that. And she said, no, compared to what we used to eat, this isn't even really food. She was a very wise professor. So, as you look at this, one of the things we talk about in our talks is that Africa has like super vegetables. That's what the slide that we have up here. And they have greens that really don't exist anywhere else. And the root food, something that was also just mentioned, I was blown away. And I realized that there's so much that were stolen from us through the process of slavery. And I've always thought about my name. I've thought about my language. I've thought about knowing a tribe. But never really thought about the fact that the nutritional value of the food that we lost in this process. And that was one of the most starking things that came to mind when I was there.
Yeah.
If I can interject, Columbus, one of the things that when I think about the continent, we came from eating from a place of abundance. When we got to America, we came from a place of eating for survival.
Yeah.
It was a completely different approach to what we put on our plate, or what was put on our plate.
That sort of thing of food as life and switching it over, and that whole idea of the diaspora. And so, Dr. Yahur, why don't you, what are your thoughts really from a historical perspective on the diaspora and so forth, just in general, for folks who may not be quite as familiar with that terminology and what that was for us specifically? And it pertains to many ethnic groups, but really specifically to those of African descent.
So I would love to share my screen for a minute on this one, Columbus, because I do want to give people a kind of a definition they can apply in other circumstances.
Perfect. Give me just a moment.
Take your time.
I will switch you over. All right. You should have the ability to do it. Yes.
Excellent. So, for me, when we talk about this, and I love the concept of food as chains, we think of the diaspora as this dispersal of people of African descent throughout the world that really was occasioned by the institution of slavery and the desire for Europeans to profit off the labor of people of African descent. But if we think about food as chains, I love this because they talk about this, if you look up at Webster's definition, a connected, flexible series of metal links. And really that describes our communities. We're flexible and we're nimble, but connected. And what connects us? Well, if we're thinking about that classic definition of diaspora, we're connected significantly by a history of racial oppression, but not singularly by a history of racial oppression. Wherever you go in the world, the one story that diasporic peoples of the African diaspora can tell in common is that we have the shared legacy of enslavement and our responses to enslavement. So it's not just the racial oppression that took place, but our resistance to that oppression. And then it's also, in spite of that, in the cultural variations and political and other rifts that divide us, we're united by this emotional and cultural tie to an ancestral homeland. In our case, because there are other diasporas, we could talk about the Jewish diaspora, we could talk about the Chinese diaspora, but for us, it's Mother Africa. So hearing Cynthia and Eric talk about going back to the continent and experiencing the continent firsthand, Ghana, where most of us trace our heritage to, West Africa, that's meaningful because we share those bonds. Last but not least, no matter where in the world these communities are located, we have faced essentially the same challenge of the process of recovery. Who were we? What was our history? You know, Eric talked about recovery of the name, which is something that we see as essential, but also the recovery of our diet, you know, our identity, the very essence of who we were as communities. And that's been a big part of this. So, you know, I've taken this from Colin Palmer, who wrote a great book, Passageways, but that's part and parcel of this as well. Last but not least, when we think about this, you know, and talking about the larger conversation here, those diaspora communities sometimes result in variations that are important. I remember the first time I was married to a woman from Jamaica. So she said we were going to have soul food for dinner one night, and I was expecting fried chicken and, you know, things that I associated. And she came out with saltfish and callaloo, and I'm like, what is this? So you know, our shared history of being enslaved and having this shared common language around people like Marcus Garvey and Ella Baker and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But within that, there are variations in even a way that we define the food that became sustenance for us in enslavement and beyond.
Absolutely. No, that's great. That's tremendous. That's tremendous. Great points. Great points. And you know, just to touch bases on that, Cynthia, I mean, tell us really more so about, and you heard really kind of dropped us right inside the pot, right, in that moment of really this journey. Because one of the things we like to really speak about is the food diaspora very specifically, this journey and the transition of foods from West Africa all the way to where we're at now. Tell us about that journey.
Well, you know, if you look at the diaspora, if you look at the transatlantic slave trade, and using the word that Yahura used, connecting, and one of the things I like to do is connect the dots back to the motherland. The largest amount of stolen and enslaved Africans went to Brazil. And if you look at Brazil's diet, there are so many things that mirror the continent. That is one country that uses palm oil heavily, which is outside of the continent. That's not something that you really see, but it speaks to the concentration of Africans on that continent. I mean, in that country, and they're coastal. And so you typically see the enslaved are in those coastal areas in a lot of those countries. Their diet very much mirrors and reflects. The names of their foods are just slightly different than they were on the continent. When you look at South Carolina, for example, the diet is very, very close. The original diet that the slaves followed there, very, very close to what was in the continent. So much of what is considered cuisine, high cuisine now, or low country food now, that everybody eats, and many of our white brothers and sisters tout, and it's a big deal for them. Those are traditional African foods. Beni seed, black-eyed peas. The slaves were brought to harvest and grow rice because they knew what they were doing on the continent. So our traditions followed us. We brought along what we could. Others could probably speak to how those things were probably brought, across. But when we got here, we sought out where we could things that reminded us of home, and those things were also incorporated into our diets.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's
I
powerful.
wanted to jump in real quick, Columbus, before you go on.
Yes.
Something that Cynthia said a second ago kind of struck me. One of the things that really is a big difference, and I saw this when I was in Africa, and even when I go to the Caribbean or South America, North America, if we talk about Black America, is a land where growing food takes some pretty significant intention in much of the continent. You get all the way up here where I'm at, up in New England, or Uhuru is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's cold. It's hard to grow things. The Europeans who got here first would not have been able to survive without, in many cases, the Indians, the Native Americans, actually showing them how to do so. So slavery took on another whole focus in that. Not only did they have to feed the slaves had to figure out how to help feed the people who brought them here. It was, so there was a unique component to it that way. Different from in the islands where a lot of people love jerk food. Like you go to Jamaica and jerk chicken, jerk this, jerk that. a lot of people don't know that food was made that way so that they could hide it from the British. They cooked it underground. And groups like the Maroons, just as Cynthia was saying, they were able to transport and transplant a lot of their African ways to a land that was more similar to theirs, and survive and actually defy the British. Whereas in North America, that was a lot more difficult. Food became either an asset or a liability in the struggle, in a sense, in a way for us that I don't think any people in history have had to deal with as African Americans.
I just
Yeah,
want
no,
to add to that. I'm
please.
sorry, very
No,
quickly.
please.
I did a documentary for History Channel called The Food That Built America. And the interesting thing about it is that we never talk about the people who supported and really helped to build the structures for the people that we celebrate as our founders and leaders in areas, not just in politics, but also cuisine. The interesting thing about this is that if we look at it in the context you're talking about it, Eric, the enslaved Africans, and I want to tie this to Cynthia as well, you know, there's a heck of a myth about us not being great swimmers, but the fact of the matter is that enslaved swimmers and divers really were the people who provided the seafood for on coastal areas for people to be able to eat. There's a rich tradition of African Americans and people who are from Cape Verde and the Caribbean being part of shipping and whaling in Connecticut, where you are. Great book by Jeff Bolster, Blackjacks. You know, again, shattering a heck of a myth about, you know, us not being seafaring or comfortable on the sea or great swimmers and divers. And the other thing, part of this, to Cynthia's point, and I'm just going to share this real quick because I think this is a really phenomenal point that was raised by a colleague of mine. You know, we forget that we not only created this, but the enslaved cooks were the ones who helped to develop the American palate. So the whole American diet is based on this melting pot in many ways. I'm going to read from Kelly Fantandiz's piece from the Smithsonian Magazine 2018, which I love, because we also want to talk about the conditions under which they helped to create this. But she wrote, Black cooks were bound to the fire 24 hours a day. They lived in the kitchen, sleeping upstairs above the hearth during the winters and outside come summertime. Up every day before dawn, they baked bread for the mornings, cooked soup for the afternoons, and created divine feasts for the evenings. They roasted meat, made jellies, cooked puddings, crafted desserts, preparing several meals a day for the white family. They also had to feed every free person who passed through the plantation. If a traveler showed up day or night, bells would ring for the enslaved cook to prepare food. For a guest, this must have been delightful. Biscuits, ham, and some brandy, all made on site, ready to eat at 2:30 a.m. or whenever you please. For the cooks, it must have been a different kind of experience. I love that, but we talk about fast food today, but the original purveyors of that were enslaved peoples, you know, bound in this way, but providing everything that we could imagine on the plantation, including creating a distinct American diet in the process.
Wow.
And
That's
a great irony to that is powerful. They could often not, on many of those plantations, they couldn't even partake of the very food they were preparing. They couldn't bring that food back to their husband, wife, or children.
Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, you know, I mean, was it Sally Hemings' brother was the great chef for Thomas Jefferson. And when you look at George Washington, his chef actually took over and had this level of eliteness to him because of he was so profound as far as in his culinary arts. And so there is a rich heritage indeed in terms that drives in. But I want us to take a step back or two as far as in this historical journey and migration. And we touch on this briefly during our conversation during the lecture, really looking at almost how food was used originally as a form of weaponization. And so speaking to how, I mean, that shifted now, we use that term now, and we'll come back to that, to modern times right now, but really speaking to the weaponization of food, really in the enslavement and the transatlantic journey, as well as inside of during the slave era. And Eric, I'm gonna let you kick it off and maybe cap that portion of our lecture series before we turn to her and to Chef Cynthia.
Well, the way I always say this is, we were given enough food so that we could work, but not quite enough food so that we could rebel. You know, the way that we were fed was, and we have a great quote from Frederick Douglass that we'll probably pull up here in a second, that really speaks to that. Obviously, food is a cost if slavery is a business, how you feed the slaves will help to determine how profitable your business is. Unfortunately, that didn't even just start on the plantation. That started on the Middle Passage. That started on the ships. If a slave captain wanted to make more money, one of the things he could adjust in his budget was how much he fed his cargo. And so it was a very difficult thing because food was used to literally as chains. You could weaken a person, you could punish a person by how you fed them, and you could reward certain ones who behaved the way you wanted, unlike the others. But I don't know if you have that Frederick Douglass.
I do. Dr. Uhura, why don't you transfer that back over to me and I'll put this up real briefly. But go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so you know, and we, you know, kind of spoiler alert. One of the things that we talk about in this Slave Food Project, and one of the things that we're after, is to show that, in fact, on many levels, that is still happening today. In our communities, the food that is provided is enough, and you can blow that all the way up once you find it. The food is enough. The food is enough so that you can live and survive, but it's not necessarily enough so that you will thrive. Not enough so that you can get over and get ahead. You know, so again, Columbus, you can talk about the slides since you have the control there.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, one of the things we speak about when we come out of this food as life, we speak to specifically food as chains. And speaking now of a book here that was written, and we speak to food was an important element of the process of turning humans into commodities. Rations scientifically calculated to provide the cheapest minimal nutrition to keep enslaved people alive. You know, and I'll have you all touch on this a bit more, but whether or not they would look to the particular area of Africa that they sought the slaves from, if it was a rice area, or if it was one more of tubers, and trying to use that in a sense of mush and so forth to feed them, and then the forced feeding of individuals who were enslaved at that time. And we take folks through as far as the food as chains, really once being here, and once again, adapting the cultures and influences and resources that were experienced inside of here. And this is the key, is the issue of providing the low on the hog. Instead of eating high on the hog, eating low on the hog, lesser cuts of such as the feet, the head, the ribs, fat back, internal organs, that we use resiliency to create survival, to stimulate our survival. And so one of the quotes Frederick Douglass gives is, he says that the rations consisted of a monthly allowance of a bushel of a third-rate corn, pickled pork, which was often tainted, and poorest quality herrings, barely enough to sustain grown men and women through their back-breaking labors in the field. Those are some of the things that we kind of mentioned there in that moment.
And I can say that I had an uncle from Americus, Georgia, explain to me a bit of what he remembers about the Deep South when he was growing up and back into slavery. And I think something that is really profound, and where slave food, the term comes from, is the slaves literally got the refuse, the food that the master thought was beneath them, they passed on to the slave. And I think that is one of the craziest, when you think about just that, so that you wind up eating chicken necks and chicken feet and, you know, and the tripe of an animal, intestines of an animal in the form of chitlins and so forth. These are you know, that's a powerful thing to think about, someone taking an animal and then saying, you know, what we would normally throw away, let that sustain you. That's slave food.
Yeah. You know, it's really powerful too, you know, with Douglass, you know, so much of what we do know about what slaves ate comes from the slaves themselves. And thank goodness we have records, you know, autobiographies and other records like Douglass's. I'm taking this from the narrative of Frederick Douglass, and I think it just speaks to the point. He's talking here about how the slaveholders fed their chattel. And he says, it was the boast of slaveholders that their slaves enjoyed more of the physical comforts of life than the peasantry of any country in the world. That was the way that they wanted to perceive themselves. But he said, my experience contradicts this. The men and the women slaves on Colonel Lloyd's farm received their monthly allowance of food, 8 pounds of pickled pork or its equivalent in fish. The pork was often tainted. The fish were of the poorest quality. To your point, Eric, with their pork or fish, they had given them 1 bushel of Indian meal, unboltered, of which quite 15% was more fit for pigs than for men. So again, this is about efficiency. If we're talking about this as a business, as you pointed out, just enough to make sure that the machine runs, but not enough to make sure the machine can run from you. And then last part of this, with 1 pint of salt was given, and there was an entire monthly allowance of full-grown slave working constantly in the open field from morning till night, every day in the month except for Sunday. When I read about this, and I think about the work of you and Columbus in particular, Eric, so much of what we attribute to health problems and health disparities in our communities of color today can be directly attributed to the roots of this diet. And anthropologists now are looking at this and forensically interrogating what this must have done to African Americans in particular in this journey from slavery to freedom. So we developed these habits, we continued to eat in this way, it's enforced on us. And then ultimately, as we look back and see the roots of some of the things that now exist in terms of diseases that prey on us, we can attribute those directly back to this diet.
Directly back to that. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that's so interesting as far as in research is that Frederick Douglass is also quoted mentioning too as well that he made a point to bring out these facts because he wanted to make a point to nail the boastful lie put out by slaveholders, one that persists even now, that slaves somehow enjoyed more of the physical comforts of life than the peasantry of any country in the world. That was a bold-faced lie in the way in which the food was manipulated for profit and for power and those at risk.
And
you know,
go ahead, Cynthia, sorry.
When you look at our communities, many of our communities now, they're still food deserts. There's still the food that is pumped into our communities are foods that have long shelf life. They're packed with salt, they're packed with preservatives because people are looking at the they're looking at the long haul. Buying fresh fruit and vegetables is something that we're having to retrain our bodies for, but you also think, well, this is a perishable item. If I've got $5, am I going to spend $3.50 on fresh fruit and vegetables? Or am I going to go to Kentucky Fried Chicken or even just, you know, where that's having a special on biscuits and chicken where I can feed my entire family for $5, $6, $7? What am I going to do? And when what's most accessible in your community is that fast food, that's where you're going to go. I lived in Leimert Park in Los Angeles up until 2017. There was every fast food chain you could imagine. The grocery store left much to be desired. Once we started gentrifying, they started bringing in better quality things. But prior to that, liquor stores, fast food places, donut shops, that's what was there. And that's what people ate because in addition to survival, that food gave us comfort. When we talk about the stress that we go through as Black people, sometimes at the end of the day, what you want to do is sit down in front of something that's just going to bring you comfort. And that comfort often comes in the form of fried carbohydrates, things that are over salted, super cheesy, those types of things. And that's what surrounds our communities.
That's huge. I want to bring up one point, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Eric, is the fact that you guys brought up repeatedly kind of like the sense of resiliency in the slaves and so forth. And what's interesting is that although they were faced with the cast-offs, the refuse, what they had to do in order to supplement their diets are things that they planted after they tended the fields, right? That they had to grow and they had to yield, and in some instances were allowed to sell those. And so we oftentimes celebrate the things that were meant to do us harm instead of celebrating the things that we did to bring about our own wellness and sustain us there. And so in a very similar way, we're given these foods that are less than ideal for our bodies on a day in and day out basis. And we don't recognize the power as the slaves did really in trying to get some of the other items that are helpful for them. Eric, sorry,
There's this kind of rich tradition of making something out of nothing in our community.
Yes.
We talk about it with music and we celebrate it in something like hip hop. I would say I haven't eaten pork in probably 37 years, something like that at this point. But as a child growing up, I always appreciated the fact that when I watched my grandmother make something like chitlins, which now I look back on and aghast, the process that she had to go through to prepare what is scavenger food is in some sense remarkable. The time that it took, how she seasoned it up. It was actually a work of creativity. If I can divorce it from its nutritional content and from all the problems that we associate with that type of diet, there was still great creativity and resilience in being able to take something that's basically the cast off and turn it into a meal and be able to feed an entire family. And I think about that in a variety of other dishes, but that one in particular.
Absolutely, it's a great point.
I'll piggyback on that. I think food, again, going back even to like the islands, and you look at Jamaican food, a lot of the food from the islands is creative and tasty and spicy, but they did it so that they could survive. I was bringing up the idea of jerk, and so that the British wouldn't find the food, they'd cook it under the ground, and that's how you got this concept of like jerk food that is now world famous. Dish that everybody loves from Jamaica, but it's a fascinating thing. I wanted to jump back as well to something I think Cynthia said earlier. It's not just that bad food or food deserts and then poor nutritional food swamps come into our neighborhoods. It's that it's also government subsidized. A lot of this food, to have the long shelf life, has to be government subsidized with crops like soy and corn. In order to have this, the government actually subsidizes these farmers. There's an overabundance, and even cow's milk, where we get the government cheese from. Then that stuff is funneled into our neighborhood, but it's the same way slavery was. The government, in a sense, subsidized the food that the master ate by allowing slavery to exist, by having a system in place that protected the slave owner and worked completely against the slave. And it took a lot of fighting. People don't often recognize the effort the slaves had to make in people like Nat Turner, who's the one that's most famous, but there were lots of those things that began to unsettle a lot of people across the country and help to move the abolitionist movement in ways that is often not recorded. And it's the same principle today. There's some movement that has to be made if we're going to be free that may not ever get recorded, but is necessary if we're going to be free.
That's right. That's right. Take a station break pause just to let folks know, if they're just tuning in on Facebook Live or joining in, that this is once again Slave Food Conversations, and we're joined, Dr. Walsh and myself, with Dr. Uhura Williams, historian from Minnesota, and we have Chef Cynthia Chia-Penn as well. And we're having an incredible conversation, really looking at this journey of food, and from the origins of Africa through the transatlantic slave trade, all the way through to our modern day. And so Dr. Walsh was just kind of commenting really on components that are really powerful there, as far as in how things have evolved in making the relationship, that jump over to modern day processed foods and the subsidies of foods. I mean, have you ever asked yourself the question, why is it cheaper to have 3 burgers, French fries, a milkshake, than it is to get a healthful salad, to have beans and rice and various things like that? Why is it cheaper to get that than the other? And there's something that's there. Why is it that it's more prevalent inside of certain neighborhoods and things of that sort than in others? And this transformation of diet, this molding of diet to conform people into a particular way, is nothing that's new throughout the eons of time. We've seen this relationship between changing a person's name and their culture and changing the diet. We've seen that before. And we've spoken about what the diets of slaves have been like. Dr. Uhura, were you going to comment? I thought you were getting ready to jump in something too as well.
Only because what you said reminded me of something I thought about in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, which was that here he was outside of Cup Foods, not Cub Foods, but Cup Foods, which is the neighborhood grocery, which is basically the swamp that Eric is talking about, where you're not going to get things of a high nutritional value. It is not whole food, so there's not going to be a lot of fresh fruit and produce. It is, in essence, a food desert now made worse by the situation or circumstances. But what was interesting to me is that, as you were talking about that, it reminded me of the 2001 documentary Life and Debt in Jamaica, where they talked about how the IMF and structural adjustment came in and wiped out the dairy industry in Jamaica, and basically for a while left people on the island drinking powder milk, which had no nutritional value in that sense. So this is something that, as you pointed out, is a theme throughout time. And when we hear someone like Al Sharpton wax eloquent about having a knee on our neck, it's easy to look at that in terms of defund the police. It's harder to see that in terms of liberate your diet.
Absolutely.
And I have to jump in because you just hit one of my favorite documentaries of
Yeah.
all time, Life and Death. That is a profound documentary on the intentionality of the destruction of Black systems. In that case, the director really goes after what happens in Jamaica. But I would submit it is the very same power grab and profit grab that destroyed not only the milk industry, the banana industry in Jamaica. And it was Bill Clinton who actually sued on the world courts for Chiquita and Dole and wiped out the banana industry on that island. And I want you to, if you carry that to the United States, you have to understand that there are people with untold millions of dollars lobbying to make sure that Cheetos remain cheap and soda pop remains cheap and fast food remains cheap, and that the government gives them profit on the front side, then we give them profit on the back side. And then sadly, the chain connects, because now I'm a physician, but I'll still say it. Now you've got to go in with your high blood pressure, diabetes, and you are now being sold medications that, again, often government subsidized, you're going to be on for the rest of your life. The profit just kind of piles on top of profit at the expense of the health and life of many people in this country.
It's huge. It's huge. When you look at really the justice standpoint, we're up in arms right now over social justice and brutality. But just back to your point, when you look at that area in Ferguson, that you had like an 18-year a life difference based on the zip code where he was murdered. That whole corridor, not that's separate. That's because of disparities in health that occurred right there. And so we have to have a transformation in our diet equally as well inside of the whole entire community to kind of lend itself to us really kind of being resilient and fighting.
It is also one of that's one of the results of the systemic racism that we are speaking out against right now. It comes across in what we eat, what we're able to eat, what we have access to eating, what is just, put out there across the board, what gets the marketing dollars, what our children see. Most children, by the time they can speak, they're able to say, I want McDonald's, I want a Happy Meal. They're programmed. We're programmed with these messages. And as Eric was saying when he spoke, when I spent the summer in Ghana, the importation of Western foods, you are seeing a direct increase of disease associated with those foods because people are getting away from their traditional foods. They see the West as aspirational. And I tell them that's nothing to aspire to. Go back to your roots and your tradition. That's what's going to keep you healthy. But if you look at that throughout the African diaspora and a lot of these countries, American foods, Western foods, preparations, all these things come in, the disease goes through the roof. People in Ghana, I had so many conversations about people, somebody that was 32 years old that would drop dead as a result of diabetes, never knew they had it. They just dropped dead. It was happening over and over and over again. And so now there is a movement there to go back to their traditional foods, because while they may not be chic, or they may not be, trendy or things like that, this is what's going to keep you alive.
Yeah, that's powerful. And
go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Eric. No, please.
No, I was just going to jump in and say, because the thing about this thing is, this slave food isn't simply a chain in the fact that they flood your neighborhood with it, but the food is actually designed. It is created and crafted, and we're going to talk about this on another episode. It is created and crafted so that you will become addicted to it, or at least it will become habitual for you. And you mentioned it earlier, Cynthia, when you talked about it as comfort food. So imagine you bring this into poor developing countries, and you bring in these foods that have been designed to hyper stimulate the palate. You drop that in Ghana, in Legon, where I was, or in Kumasi, and someone, and you drop this on people who've never had anything like this. It's a shock to the system. I see it in Jamaica when I go to Jamaica, and I think it's really important that we recognize this. In America and in the West, the golden arches are more easily recognizable. To your point, Cynthia, about a kid saying McDonald's first, is more easily recognizable than the cross on a church, or even the crescent moon and the star on a mosque. I mean, literally, the golden arches are literally the most probably the most well branded thing on much of the planet. And that is a problem in and of itself, because the other way they make this food, us slaves to this food, is how they advertise it to us.
That's right. That's right. You know, and one of the key things is, I mean, there's a great book called The Pleasure Trap, and speak to what's innate. So it's natural when you put these foods in front of us, our natural tendency is to try and avoid pain, to seek pleasure and conserve energy. And what these foods do, they give us this false sense, this created sense, this chemically engineered pleasure, heightened sense with the dopamine and so forth. We can have it, we can get the food without any cost, without any pain. We don't have to chew. That's it. We don't have to expend any energy. That's there. And it vanishes. So now perceptively, we perceive it as if we haven't eaten anything, that we haven't drank anything. Yep. That's right. Vanishing calories. So there's so much power in the science that's gone behind the scenes to really craft and develop the foods that are encompassing all urban communities on a regular basis.
And those are the things that are killing us. If you really look, it's the in-between foods that are taking us out, you know, because children come home after school or on their way home, they're eating a bag of chips. How much fat is in that? How much salt is in that? Then you're going to go home and have a whole nother meal. And if you're up late, then you're going to have some more snacks. So you are going, you know, your daily allowance, you've blown past it. There are some foods out there that you literally surpass your fat, your fat gap per day.
That's right.
In one meal, you just don't think about it.
Yeah. I want to take us back for a second, because we touched on something. Cynthia, you spoke about our communities being almost created, and you kind of described a component of our talk where we walk folks through this migration from slavery to the Reconstruction to the Great Migration era, and some of the things that we succumbed to as a result of redlining, as a result of being restricted from generational wealth, and communities that were created as a result of this, that are devoid of a lot of different assets that communities of other individuals were just profound in having. And so, you know, that brought us up to really the civil rights era. And so, Dr. Hura, give us some sense from a historical perspective about this. And Eric, I'd like to get your thoughts too as well, chiming in after that.
Well, you know, it's interesting because when we think then about this process of leaving the South and making the transition from being kind of the agricultural foundation of the South, the kind of backbone labor force, to moving north, what did the freed people bring with them? And what was that journey like? And how did they provide for sustenance on that journey? That defines really not just the period after the Civil War and Reconstruction, but the early part of the 20th century. We think about, for example, the Green Book, the wildly successful movie based on the experience of Black people having to know when you went on a journey, not just how to get there. It wasn't just as simple as I need a map quest. It was, you know, what hotels can I stay at? What restrooms can I use? Which again, we don't think about the convenience associated with that. And then where can I eat? So, you know, when I was at the Jackie Robinson Foundation, my favorite story about Jack is at one point, you know, people like to call him Jackie, but his wife called him Jack, and he liked to be called Jack. It's the way we diminish men of color and people of color. So I always like to call it out. But Jack and his teammates had gone out to play, and they were being denied the opportunity to use the restroom in a place where they were going to fill up on gas. And Jack said, "We won't get the gas here. We'll wait." And the rest of his teammates moaned and groaned, but he was saying, and making a point even then, he wasn't going to be demeaned by being denied the opportunity to use the facilities where he was going to spend good, you know, green American dollars in order to fill up this bus for for his team. But it does point to the reality that in deficit is how we've always had to meet those basic needs. And in the process, when we think about the most enduring images of the civil rights movement, beyond the desegregation of schools, so everybody thinks about Little Rock, and that's fine. But next in line is the sit-ins. people sitting in at lunch counters, making the same argument about, if I'm going to spend my money here, I should have the right to eat here. But we fail to interrogate sometimes what they were actually trying to gain access to, and that was a cup of coffee and a hamburger. It's almost ironic that the American dream, and Eric's point, has come down to access to this diet, which actually is not healthy. And in the process, we lose a little bit of the memory of those establishments like the Florida Avenue Grill in Washington, D.C., where Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP attorneys wrote the briefs for some of the most important cases that led to Brown versus Board of Education. But what were they eating there? Collard greens and mustard greens, and this Southern food that didn't only include fried foods, but often included some very healthy side foods that we forget. Sweet potatoes, as Cynthia talked about, the vestiges and shadows of healthy portions of our diet, which sometimes get lost in translation. Wasn't all bad. There were actually some things that we could celebrate in what they were eating. But it's also this question of, what did access to places of public accommodation guarantee us? In some sense, one of the reasons that you have organizations like the Nation of Islam in the early 1960s making the case that integration was in Malcolm X's terminology, a bad goal for us, is that he says, once you're integrated, you'll be fully integrated. And part of integration is having to accept the full weight of what it means to be a second-class citizen. And often that's expressed not just at what happens at the ballot box, but what people put in front of you every time you sit down to take a meal, where you lose autonomy even in the most basic engagement that you have is the nourishment and sustenance of your own body.
Yeah, that's deep. That's deep. That's incredible. I mean, that's one of the things. Go ahead, Eric.
I was gonna say, I got to jump in on that, because he just made an incredibly good point. And I used to love to read Malcolm, and Brother Malcolm really did. And I'll be honest with you, if you really look at what he said, there's a lot of truth in what he was saying, and you can see it now in how in the condition of our people. But one of the things that is imperative is, with all of the progress, quote unquote, that we've gotten, it's interesting that we actually have less choice. If you look at it, you put someone into a poor inner city neighborhood, and you say, listen, you need to choose to eat better. They don't have that much choice.
No choice.
There's not as much choice as you want them to believe that they have. So in a sense, in some ways we lost choice. Even from when we were on a field where we could grow stuff, we've lost choice, and that is part of the change. That's part of the way that food is used as change, because you think you have a choice. So even when they say, "Listen, you need to eat that; it's healthier," a lot of times it's just marketing. It's just them shifting from sugar to salt, or salt to fat, or they're just moving the bad food around so that they can sell more product and make you think you're getting something healthier when you actually never had a choice.
In fact, Eric, having grown up in the 70s, I remember this distinctly. Choice for me meant what flavor of Kool-Aid we were going to drink, never connecting that it was the same tap water and too much sugar and food coloring that I think about, it's an analogy that sometimes works very well, but we think about the allegory of the cave. In Plato, and it goes very deep in that people don't know they know the form of something, but not actually what something is. So they know the form of justice, but not justice, because we live in a world of shadows. I didn't know what orange was because I didn't eat oranges. I ate orange flavoring. I ate cherry flavoring. I ate these things and then by the time I was old enough to make my own choices, to your point, and I had enough money to eat in spaces when it was exposed to people who were eating healthy, I'm like, oh, this is what a cherry tastes like? This can't be watermelon, because this is not what my Charlie Chan candy tastes like. And therein lies the problem.
Yeah. No, that's so key, man. And I know, Cynthia, you want to jump in. I never forget my daughter, who's now 15. She was probably about 2, and always just precocious and could say anything. Took her, and I got some fresh squeezed orange juice, and she said, "Daddy, this tastes like oranges." I said, "Yeah, baby, it's orange juice." "No, Daddy, it tastes like oranges. It tastes like oranges." And I'm sitting there, and it clicked that this poor child has not actually, she's had processed, pasteurized, whatever orange juice, but not enough of oranges. And at that moment, this was the beginning of my journey, whatever. I've been aggressively into this for about the past 12 years of her, of her 15-year life. Bought a juicer. It was on. We were buying, we were juicing up everything in that moment there. So it's true. Our palates are completely transformed to this fake that they break it down to a chemical structure to mimic it at a heightened level of intensity, even from a sugar content where it was not meant to be, transforming our palates. And we think the norm is the abnorm, and it changes everything. Cynthia, sorry to cut you off.
You know, one of the things I was thinking about is, again, when I lived in Los Angeles, 3 of the highest income earning Black neighborhoods were maybe 1 or 2 minutes away from me. So I'm talking about Angeles Vista, Windsor Hills, and View Park. Good Black money there. No real healthy choices. And when they're Simply Wholesome. Simply Wholesome is there. And it's been there for years. That's like the standard bearer in the community where you could get healthy food. But when Whole Foods decided to open a new Whole Foods, they very easily could have placed it somewhere close to those neighborhoods. Yeah. And I would think that they would have done pretty well. But what did they do? They went just far enough away so that if you really wanted to go out of your way, you could have access to it, but they weren't making it easy. What was easy were the same old, same old. And I thought that was really interesting. In the United States of America, these are the 3 highest money earning Black zip codes. And they're still not healthy food within a 3-4 mile radius of this area, of the neighborhood. So it tells us that we're just not a priority. We're not a priority when our health is not a priority. Let's say that. Our dollars are a priority for them, but our health is not a priority for them. And they know basically if this is all they have to eat, this is what they will eat.
It's reminiscent of the whole Magic Johnson when he went in and he said, listen, Black people drink Starbucks. Black people go to movies. I'm going to put a Starbucks and prove to you that we will buy and support Starbucks. Now, whether or not that's the most helpful thing or not, but just conceptually from a business model to minimize really the power of the dollar that comes out of these communities that spend an awful lot, I think is an injustice. Now, I do want to shift and ask a question. It's for all 4 of you. What's the difference between slave food and soul food? Or is there a difference between slave food and soul food?
Well, I think it depends on how you
go ahead, Cynthia. You first.
I think it depends on how you define those 2 things. I think slave food, again, harkens to survival. That's in my thinking, that's what I would say. Soul food to me is more so comfort food. It is food that I associate with those warm, fuzzy feelings, you know, things that my mother would prepare, things that are traditional foods that we ate on special occasion, things like that. So while they, you know, so there could be a mix of things that aren't necessarily healthy and things that are healthy. But slave food to me is food, as you talk about, it's the refuse. It's, you know, it's the bottom of the barrel.
And, you know, there's a historic component to what Cynthia is talking about too, because, you know, for so much of our history, I think about the famous Melville Herskovitz and E. Franklin Frazier debate about what was Black culture, you know, what was, you know, Black music. And so there were so many things that Black people had influenced, like jazz, but when it came down to it, white scholars and white cultural critics would never acknowledge in any substantive way that we had our own culture. The whole dialogue around soul food actually began in the 1960s, 1962. The person who's kind of credited with coining the term is Amiri Baraka, who wrote an essay in 1962 where he talked about, you know, what do you mean Black people don't have food? And he talked about Hoppin' John, black eyed peas and rice, hush puppies, crusty cornmeal bread, cooked in fish grease, and best with fried fish, especially fried saltfish, which you soak overnight unless you're 50 and you can't take all that salt. I mean, he was breaking it down. This to me, it was almost like a testimony about what our people in urban centers ate, right? And also in rural centers, but he goes on, hoe cake, pancake, buttermilk biscuits and pancakes, fatback, i.e. steak a lean, steak a fat, dumplings, neck bones, knuckles, both good for seasoning, lima or string beans. I mean, he's basically transporting me to my living room in the 1970s. okra, which I hated, pork chops, grits, eggs and sausage, pancakes with alaga syrup, a chicken wing on a piece of greasy bread, a piece of barbecue hot enough to make you whistle, and small sweet potato pies. And so this was Amiri Baraka's attempt to answer this critic by saying, what do you mean we haven't produced a culture, we don't have our own culture? And it became part of the Black Power movement of how we were reclaiming, as part of this process of historical recovery, who we were and what was unique about us, what we had contributed to the American experience, but more importantly, what made us distinctively Black. Because part of Black Power was, as Malcolm said it, learning to love ourselves and what it is that we saw as being best about us. Now, the irony is that when Baraka writes this in '62, he's answered by Elijah Muhammad the same year in the Muhammad Speaks. And in that piece, Elijah Muhammad was like, kind of taking a swipe at soul food and saying, we shouldn't be eating white bread. It has no nutritional value. And ironically, there's a added layer of irony here, because he was basically saying we should be eating brown bread. But he said, look, hearty wheat bread, brown bread has much more nutritional value. And he was also kind of poking fun at the fact that we needed to clean up our diets, because later on he'll write a book, How to Eat to Live. People weren't eating to live, they were actually eating and putting poison in their bodies. So a large part of the Muslim message that Malcolm had very strong, that Elijah Muhammad had very strong, was about eating Black, which meant eating out of the Muslim grocery stores that would serve you foods high in nutritional content that didn't include the staples of soul food. So it became part of the struggle between the two forces to define what food was distinctly Black, but at the same time, what food was healthy.
That's great.
I would jump in and say I love that piece there, because I used to eat at a lot of those mosques and stuff back in the day, and the bean pies and stuff. It was always interesting that they thought beans were a good thing to make pies, or beans are actually pretty healthy. But I think one of the biggest differences between slave food and soul food for me is potential. Slave food has no potential to be healthy. Slave food is designed to keep you weak. Soul food can be used as comfort food, to Cynthia's point, and be unhealthy, but inherently mixed in. Even when you read that description, there's a lot of stuff in there I would advise Black people against eating. But I would definitely say the lima beans, the okra. And I was a kid, I hated okra. I eat okra almost every morning now for breakfast. So there's potential in the soul food side. And I can tell you, if anybody on or listening that's not eaten from the hand of Chef Cynthia over here, she could make some soul food that's healthy, tasty, have you licking your fingers, and I mean, it's just amazing. So soul food has potential. And I mean, in a sense, we have to redefine soul food by, one, going back to Africa and really reclaiming the foods that were stolen from us. We get a glimpse of this in the Caribbean, because things like susumba and other foods from the Caribbean are African foods transplanted. But here in the United States, we don't have that so much. And so reclaiming those foods, bringing them into the family of soul food, and taking some of the foods that we have and making them their healthy version, so that potential is realized.
Yeah. I'll add to that,
Yes.
just one quick thing. Thanks. I know we're on to kind of wrap things up here. So I just want to bring up a couple of little points here. One is, when I look at soul food versus slave food, I really look at soul food really as a memorial or a reflection of the era of slave food and bringing it back. But we lose track of the fact of the resiliency and tapping into that resiliency. And that's the one thing that I really learned throughout readings, is the fact that, once again, that our forefathers, they actually tilled the land to provide additional, that they were able to make something out of nothing in terms of the refuse. They were able to kind of really still capture parts of their heritage by growing these vegetables and the fruits and so forth. And so when we look at this memorial, this recognition, this anniversary, the way we approach soul food, we should really highlight those points. We should really highlight the points that we come from a rich heritage of resiliency, that we have the potential to tap into foods that can energize us and build upon that resiliency and transform our DNA. Tapping into our better selves is really the portion that we have to focus on. And that's why that's so powerful to me, looking at the difference between those two subsets.
We've got some questions from the audience that I wanted to add here. And the first one is for Chef Cynthia. What do you recommend as a staple meal for those transitioning to a plant-based lifestyle?
Oh, wow. I would say a basic meal that's going to hit every single nutritional need for you would be like steamed brown rice. I would do some sauteed kale or sauteed spinach or sauteed collards. I would do some beans, something like that. Tofu is a great protein source as well, but I know some people have issues with that. So I would say beans, a nice green vegetable, a nice hearty grain, a slice of avocado if you're an avocado lover. Something like that is very simple. And when you cook your greens, by the way, do not cook your greens until they're paper thin and about to just boil away. A simple stir fry, add a little bit of water and let it steam for about 10-15 minutes. That's all you need for delicious greens.
Thank you. We received a question from a Will Greer, and he said, one thing that's clear is the contrast between life in pre-antebellum African and Europe. Can you talk more about the stratification systems that exist in Europe, but not in Africa, or other major differences?
Who is that directed to?
Whoever can answer it.
European stratification, that's a little bit above my pay.
And I was trying to, can you repeat it, Danette? I'm sorry.
Again, let me get back.
Thank you.
Okay.
If you click on the Q&A section
Yes.
on the bottom right-hand side, you can actually pop it up under the answered questions.
Yes, so he said, one thing that's clear is the contrast between life in pre-antebellum Africa and Europe. Can you talk more about the stratification systems that existed in Europe, but not in Africa, or other major differences?
But that's a deep question, and it could take, that would be a lecture. That's a wonderful question. But I think it's germane. I'll try to make it germane to this conversation because it's actually much deeper. But the idea that stratification within Europe produced variations in diet. So there's a great English historian, E.P. Thompson, that talked about the making of the English working classes. And part of his argument is that culture is a process. So what we do for leisure, what we eat, where we go, how we speak, are all a product of our neighborhood and the way that we interact with people who are on our social strata, right? So as when you come to the Americas, the diaspora was the great leveler in some sense, because what ends up happening is that what we consider Black is so expansive because it doesn't include so much that comes from the West Indies, that comes from, our experience in, Cynthia mentioned Brazil. So we end up with this diaspora that's very large and very rich, and we still identify as Black, but in some sense, when we run into that stratification sometimes, so for example, when I was talking earlier about first time I had yard food, which they were calling soul food, I'm like, that ain't soul food, that's something else. But at the same time, then being enriched by that, because by virtue of being Black, it gave me access to Jamaican patties and so on and so forth. And so this richness of culture that comes as a result, where that stratification, although it touches our communities economically, doesn't necessarily touch them in terms of diet. It's more prevalent today as we make healthier choices and we have access and opportunity, that we're not all living in the same, we're not all in Tulsa in 1921, bound not only by racial oppression, but affinity. Now we're able to make different choices, and that stratification that we would have seen in Europe is more prevalent in our communities today. I hope that's a deep question, Will. He's probably a professor, Will. That's a great question.
Okay, this one might be easier. Let's see. How can healthy foods be made readily available in our communities?
I'll jump in first on this one. And something I've been talking about a lot the last few weeks since we've seen these uprisings in the streets of America is a lot of people have asked, how can we contribute? And specifically, faith organizations and churches have been on a lot of talks. And let me, again, just say, if churches want to contribute to this, they can easily set up, I shouldn't say easily, but they can set up community gardens, urban gardens. They do a lot of work around setting up markets inside on their compounds. Once a week they can have a farmers market and have local farmers bring things in. And let's say some of those local farmers don't want to come all the way into where you are, you can go out there and get it and bring it in. I think that's one thing. And then I think the second thing is something that Cynthia can probably speak more to. I think one of the things too is cooking classes. I think I'm gonna stick with just the faith. There are churches everywhere. Those things would be profound if you improve nutritional literacy, cooking classes, and made whole fruits and vegetables more available in our communities.
Because a lot of people simply just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't know where to begin.
Mm-hmm.
And they may have had a bad experience with something early on and they've been turned off from it. Diabetes, one of the best ways to fight diabetes is by eating okra. People have okra, but that is something that you can literally eat and repair your body. Wow. There are so many things out there that are nutrient dense that heal us from within. But if you don't know, you don't know. We need to educate our people not only about what to eat, but where to get them. There are co-ops out there that people can join so they can have access to these foods. There are community gardens, like you spoke of, that people can have access to if they buy into it. You can buy a raised bed, a planting bed to grow your own fruits and vegetables. A lot of these communities, you can do it. You can grow things in no time. So really what it is, it's taking back ownership of your health. I think a lot of us have outsourced our health.
Yes.
And the FDA does not care about your health. Publix and Kroger's does not care about your health. The bottom line for them is money. So it's up to us to take that power back and figure it out. But yes, faith systems can help us with that. Absolutely. Because that's where a lot of us still go. And we are to be stewards not only of our, they talk about time, temple, talent, and treasure. We're to be stewards of our bodies as well. And that falls by the wayside. We talk about tithing back to the church, giving our 10%, but there's also responsibility we have of maintaining our temples.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Did anyone else want to add to that, or we're good? Okay.
I just want to say,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, you first, Eric.
No, you go first.
I was just going to say, I think one of the reasons I'm really encouraged by this moment is having different states, counties now declare racism a public health crisis. I think it's going to elevate conversation around diet for the first time in a way that it'll be unavoidable in the conversation. The reality is that when we think about health disparities, the last thing sometimes we talk about, if you're in particular communities, you wed diet and exercise. We're talking about food deserts and food insecurity, but if you're not wedding that to conversations around diet and exercise, you're not getting at the underlying public health concern that really should be at top of mind when we're talking about kind of reforming and reimagining healthy systems. So even in this moment, and I remember when the Obama administration came out and said, we want to get rid of sugary drinks, and people lost their mind because, you had to have a Sprite in the vending machine at school. And, people are like, oh, it's going to be so expensive if we do otherwise. Well, last time I checked, water is free. So, there is that economic component that informs this, but I do think the public health crisis debate and racism being included in that will, for the first time, create an opportunity for faith systems with the health message, like the Seventh-day Adventists, for health educators, for people who are proponents of more natural food and better diet, to have a space in the conversation where traditionally that's not been incorporated in the way that we talk about race and health disparity.
Absolutely.
No, one thing I was going to jump in and just say is the other thing is I remember being a resident physician, or maybe I was on faculty by then at Loma Linda. I was on faculty, Loma Linda University Medical School, and this town that, going back to the Seventh-day Adventists, had never had a McDonald's in it. And they were going to put a McDonald's in. I don't know if you guys remember this. People were picketing on the streets with signs. You'd have thought grandmama got ran over by a car. They were out there picketing and fighting for McDonald's not to come into their town. let me tell you something. With all of the protesting and activism that's going on, we can say, listen, enough is enough. We have enough fast food joints in our neighborhood. We are going to the city council and saying, listen, don't bring nothing else in unless it's going to offer us some nutritionally valuable options. That is something that we can agitate for now. The other thing I want to do, I want to piggyback on something Cynthia said that I thought was really profound. You got to think about it. It's the Food and Drug Administration. Think about that for a second. They lump food and drugs together. Why? Because they know if they give you the food they recommend for you to eat, you're going to need their drugs. And every dope boy in America will tell you the money's in the drugs. So, they want to push drugs on us like crazy. The biggest pushers are not from the hood. The biggest pushers are billionaire corporations that addict people to medications and pills that they have to take the rest of their lives to think they can feel healthy. When in fact, it's a shadow, as to use your analogy earlier, it's a shadow of health. People are barely surviving. I'm a physician. Let me tell you something. I'm sometimes saddened to see people come in their 60s, barely alive, with oxygen hooked up to them, in wheelchairs, and know that these people are going to live like that for another 15, 20 years because the medicine just going to prop them up. My challenge to you is live so that you can live strong all the way through to the end. And make those choices every day so you have life all the way to the end.
Yeah, getting that health span.
And the beautiful thing about it is we have that power. A plant-based diet or a heavily plant-based diet, even if you occasionally have some animal protein, you can turn your health around. I'm sure we all know people that were insulin-dependent diabetics. And within a month or 2 months of eating this way, their bodies reset. It's not impossible. That is the beautiful thing about it. The same thing that's killing us, we can harness the power of food to heal our bodies.
That's right. That's right. It reminds me of this conversation briefly here. Number one, slave food, we describe it as the manipulation of nutrition for profit and for power. And that's what it ultimately is looking at the industry, is looking to make money. And the one key thing I want to say to just augment what everyone else has mentioned is that we have to really focus and shift the narrative. We focus so much on what we don't do. I'm not eating this, I'm not eating that, I'm restricting ourselves, and we have this negative connotation. We need to focus, what are you eating for your health? We describe this inside of our lecture, The Journey, really about nutritional stress. It's not only eating disease-forming foods, it's also the absence of health promoting foods. We have to focus on what are we eating on a day in and day out basis that's really invigorating us. I told a patient this today. I say it's like this. When I ask you about what food you're eating and you tell me, I'm eating whatever I want, I say it's like me asking you, what fuel are you putting into your gas tank? You're in this high powered Porsche or Bentley or Aston Martin, right? And it says premium unleaded. You can't put diesel. You can't put corn oil and expect it to run effectively the way it's supposed to. You have to put the food that's of value in it. And so that's really what I want to stress. What are you eating for your health? That's the key. What are you a slave to?
And let me say that something Columbus said earlier struck me, and I want to highlight it again. The slaves, I believe our people survived because of the resilience of finding ways to add in nutrient-dense foods when, if it was up to the master, you would have really just gotten processed carbohydrates, fried foods, and animal products. They figured out a way. Doogie, I don't know if you ever heard of Doogie. My uncle's mother from deep in Georgia, she would make this stuff as a blueberry dessert. When I look back on it, it was a lot, there's a lot of sugar and stuff in it, but man, that thing was full of blueberry. The amount of antioxidants that they got by making that thing and eating it was pretty profound in hindsight. Now that I know all I know about blueberries, the resiliency that we use then, we have to use now. Because the truth of the matter is, just as much is at stake, and the nefarious nature of what is happening to us, as we show when we talk about how our people are advertised to, it's still there. And unless we are intentional about reversing some of these things, we are going to just be the reservoirs of disease for someone else's profit.
And that's a good segue into the next question with regard to COVID and how, the climate of COVID is essentially, how do you break the chains regarding COVID?
All right, I deal with COVID all day, every day. This has been my this has been my bane for the last 3 months. This coronavirus is not going away, as you can see. People don't believe in it. They don't want to wear masks. So I would say the first thing is just follow some of the public health guidelines. I would agree. There has been a bit of kind of hyper excitement to making people nervous, but the scientific facts are there to follow those things first and foremost. But I would say that what we do know is that the same lifestyle predictors that would shorten your life around chronic disease are the exact same ones that put you at high risk for coronavirus. The studies, the CDC was basically sued. They didn't want to release the racial data around this disease, and they just had to release it. And we've just came across the news wires. We just found another disparity, and that is that not only are Blacks and Latinos getting the coronavirus at higher rates, dying from it at higher rates, it's younger. So all of those things are happening at younger ages, literally like 15 years. I think one of the studies I read in aggregate earlier. I want you to think about that for a second. This isn't so. On the one hand, you look at a third of the deaths are in nursing homes, right? So those people, unfortunate as the deaths are, they didn't probably have a long amount of life left, except when it comes to Black and brown people. All of a sudden, the number comes pulling back out of the nursing home into the streets, where people are still taking care of their families, still supposed to be contributing to society, and yet the disease is striking them down. Why? The third phase of this disease is a hyper-inflammatory phase, where you get a cytokine storm from the immune system. Here's what we know. If you eat a diet that is anti-inflammatory, you are very much safe, or much more safe, I'll put it that way, from this disease. Something Cynthia mentioned earlier about the way that we can eat. Let me tell you something. This is where leafy greens, nuts, seeds, avocado, fruits, especially those high antioxidant fruits, compounds like resveratrol you find in blueberries, quercetin you find in a lot of pigmented foods, plant foods, and zinc, which is rich in beans and whole grains and stuff. These foods literally protect you from the disease. And that's why you're not seeing the same death rates in certain places as you are in others. It is literally because of diet, because the people are not in a pro-inflammatory state. So my word to you is, if there was ever a time to consider a predominantly or altogether plant-based whole food diet, now is the time, in the middle of this pandemic.
Amen. And I'm going to be a broken record as a cardiologist. The heart, I love the heart. This disease attacks the lining of the vessels to invade, called the endothelium. The endothelium is the rich layer that lines all the vessels throughout the whole entire body. And the key is that we know that once the vessels are damaged, there goes the risk of diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, lung disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that these foods that are rich in plant sources, like Eric just mentioned, they empower, they heal the lining that's there, and it becomes so important. So when you intake these foods, you intake like your broccoli, and they did studies showing that actually the broccoli can stimulate what's called your T killer cells to help ward off the infection right there, right? They've done studies looking at how your endothelium can become enriched with dietary nitrates and so forth through the use of cruciferous vegetables, your kale and your broccoli and things of that nature. And so there is power. Once again, it brings me back to my earlier statement. What are you eating for your health, right? As opposed to focusing on what I don't do this, I don't do that. What do you do becomes always the key.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for your responses to these questions. We have some other ones and we'll address them later, but I want to leave enough time for the ending for you guys to talk about breaking the chains. So thank you.
All right, thanks. So we'll wrap things up, and kind of closing remarks really over this powerful conversation of as food has changed, this diaspora, the food diaspora, kind of moving through. Really, give me your reflections on where we've come and where we need to go. And some of us we've done this to some degree right now, but let's sum it up for the audience and really their call to action. What do you want the audience to know, and what do you want the audience to really do to empower them? We'll start ladies first.
Well, I would say one of the things that I heard earlier is eat to live. Recognize that as a community, the things Dr. Walsh was just talking about an anti-inflammatory diet. Most of the diseases that we as a people of color suffer from are inflammatory diseases. So we have to be very proactive about our health because the system is set up against us. And with what's happening now with COVID in particular, it's really just exposed everything. It's exposed everything. And if we are not deliberate and proactive, we will bear the brunt, continue to bear the brunt of this. The beautiful thing about it is we have the power in our hands. There are a lot of resources out there that we can take advantage of to have healthier diets, nutrient-dense diets. It may mean sacrifices in other parts of our life, but that is most important because you have one body. You have one body, so we definitely need to be stewards of it, and we need to eat as, we need to eat as though we have a desire to live on and on and on. You don't want to be 80 years old and in terrible health either. It's interesting. There's people that just want to live a long life. I want to live a long, healthy life. And so let's make decisions and move in that direction.
Very good. Thank you. Eric. Actually, I'm sorry, Dr. Uhura. Let me go with Dr. Uhura first.
It's kind of hard to follow Cynthia on that. I would say, as a historian, I think about an organization like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. We sometimes focus so solely on the fact that the Panthers picked up the gun and wanted to patrol the police. We forget sometimes that in their 10-point program, point number 10 was, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and a people's community control of modern technology. In 1968, 69, or 72, when the second iteration of this came out, they were calling all the things that in our current moment continue to contribute to disparities in communities of color. But I want to note that this also reflects Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where do they start? With land and bread. And before you get to some abstract thing called freedom, as Elaine Brown, who headed up the party in the 70s, talked about, you got to start with the basic stuff. And that means that the revolution sometimes is what you can control. And the most immediate things that you can control, sometimes the housing may not be the piece, but certainly you can control what you put into your body. I love the fact that the Panthers started a breakfast for school children program that was eventually co-opted by the government because they recognized that kids didn't get a healthy breakfast, and that meant that they weren't ready to show up for school. And so then government started Operation Head Start. But I want to point out, they didn't wait for the government, they started a healthy breakfast program, and then the government took it over. We shouldn't wait for the government to dictate to us what a healthy diet looks like or how that shows up, and we should be influencing that through our activism as well, as Eric talked about. Last but not least, the Panthers had a food drive. We forget about that. It was called the People's Free Food Program. And what I love about this is that in so doing, they were able to shape what went into people's cupboards at home. And part of this was this message that they were trying to develop even at that time about what it would take to nourish people so they could effectively show up as stewards of their community. Again, the idea is that we can spend all the time talking about demilitarized zones, defunding police, and all the other things that we know are wrapped up in this conversation about racial inequality and disparity in this country. But at the end of the day, it's what we can control that represents our most immediate way to satisfy the need to have some control and get that knee off our neck, to borrow a phrase.
Amen. That's great. That's great. Love it. Love it. Eric.
I think I want to first of all just say how incredible it's been to be on with Dr. Williams and Chef Cynthia. Really learned a lot. Dr. Williams, you're a brilliant historian, and you brought out some things tonight that I see things differently based on how you put it. I know Cynthia's work because she is, again, one of the most amazing healthy chefs I've ever come across. So it's been an honor being on with both of you. I'll just say this to finish. To your point, Dr. Williams, there's a lot of movement right now, a lot of activity around justice and fairness. But I'm telling you, if we don't focus on improving the health status of the individual in the Black community, and really all of America when you step back and look at it, but specifically for Black America, if we don't do that, there's a lot to be lost in productivity, in progress, in ingenuity and creativity. There's so much that is untapped A great example is the documentary Dr. Columbus Batiste was just in, The Game Changers. I've had people watch it and come back and just be blown away at the idea that you could actually enhance athletic performance by going to a healthier, whole food, plant-based diet. Um, so that's athletics, that's high-end athletics. What would such a diet do in your daily life? In your ability for your children to do well in school, in your ability to come up with a new concept that you might be able to package, market, and sell? Could it be that we are not tapping our full resources because we are not eating the best possible diet? And I want to leave that with people, that is another way that you can stay enslaved, by not allowing you to reach your highest level of potential.
That's great. That's great. I mean, and then on this note, I mean, I think the one thing I've learned from all of this, as we've discussed through the journey, and I love history. So in another life, I would have been a historian, as brilliant as Dr. Williams himself. But when I look at these chains that link us to different phases to each other and so forth, I believe we are linked back to this idea of slave food. But I choose to focus, as we brought out earlier, the resiliency that the slaves really encompass inside of their being, growing foods to sustain themselves, of doing things. And what I want to really truly encourage folks is the fact that we too can tap into that. We can tap into that heritage to really transform our bodies and link ourselves there first and foremost, so in that way we can transform our epigenes. We can turn off and turn down these likelihood of genes towards diabetes and heart disease and cancer and these useless deaths that we're experiencing on a regular basis. This message, although we're aiming it specifically to the African American culture, this message, this hope that we're delivering to you, is also to the entirety of America, because it impacts everyone the same. And so we have to look forward to embracing that. And so I've so enjoyed this conversation. I mean, I feel as if I'm smarter. You know, it's like you want to be inside of a room with smarter people, right? And so in that way, it uplifts you. There's an old adage I was told inside of training by an attending. He said, listen, the problem in institutions is A people hire B people hire C people hire D people. You always want to hire up. And I feel through my partnership with Dr. Eric Walsh, bringing into the same room as Dr. Williams and Chef Penn, I've elevated myself. I've hired up, so to speak, in terms of my association today. I want to encourage folks who are on the fence to log in and sign up on slavefood.org. Follow us on Facebook right here and gather more information as we try and give information that can transform your lives. We're looking to come back again next week with another conversation that we're looking to have, this time with none other than, right now it's looking as if it's Dr. Terry Mason on July 17th, once again at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, speaking on Sicker and Sooner. Now, Dr. Terry Mason, for some of you who may not know, was featured in Forks Over Knives. He was featured in as well inside of Game Changers, and he is a well-known, renowned urologist who led out in Chicago, really in transforming the health system. And so we look forward to kind of having a discussion with him amongst perhaps one or two other special guests at that time. But I do want to encourage you, log in, follow us, share this. Take a moment to share this video,
Send us
host a
around.
watch party. Follow us on YouTube at the Slave Food Project, and we look forward to seeing you make transformative changes. Message us, post online about your changes. Post and let us know about how all of a sudden your diabetes, you're leaving behind the insulin. Let us know about how you're no longer requiring a stent because your chest pain is all gone. We want to hear about the changes that you can achieve. But thank you once again for joining us. On behalf of the Slave Food team, we will see you next week. Thank you all very much. Well, I think I'm
Still recording, still live on Facebook.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sorry about that. I promise I can put stents in much better than
We believe you.
all right, and I'm gonna get off on here too as well.
I gotta jump off. I'm doing a talk for India in a little while, so it's a really strange time zone difference. But I'll link up with you guys later. Cynthia, so wonderful to see you. Queen, always looking good.
You as well. You got to come down when you can. We'd love
Yeah,
to
once I
host you.
can. I'm in that area a lot, so I'll have to check you. And